Hey everyone, welcome to On Tap. I'm Chris, and I'm not an expert, just a guy who enjoys good beer. I have a question for you. What exactly is a lager? So first of all, I have to specify, I'm not an expert on this, I'm just a guy who's interested in the topic, have done some research, read on it a bit, and pretty much don't have any idea what I'm talking about. So second of all, let me now give you all of my opinions. So lager is, as you probably could guess, a style of beer. Not only that, but it's overwhelmingly the most popular style of beer on planet Earth, and has been so for at least more than a century, though arguably not multiple centuries, which is interesting. A lager is a beer that has to be brewed at cool temperatures. Lagers are fermented at cool temperatures and then further conditioned in cold storage. And as a result of this, the development of refrigeration has helped tremendously in making the lager the global favorite when it comes to beer styles. Secondly, a lager is a beer that uses bottom fermenting yeast in the brewing process. This is in comparison to ales, an older style of beer, that use top fermenting yeast at warmer temperatures. And it's also no surprise that this bottom fermenting yeast needs to work at cooler temperatures. And this bottom fermenting yeast style was also developed, it seems, as some sort of a hybrid kind of yeast in kind of the 14 or maybe early 1500s by the Germans. So it's about 600 years old, though there's a healthy margin of error for that. Thirdly, I would argue that lagers tend to have a pretty sort of standard alcohol by volume, about 4.5 to about 5.5%, which, if you think about a standard generic drink, this would be by any sort of global standard, a 12-ounce pour of 5% ABV beer, yeah, that's pretty much gonna be a lager. So with all the beers that I'm going to talk about, they're pretty much brewed using that exact brewing process I just talked about. That's what makes them, well, lagers. But within that broad category, there are a lot of subcategories. The two biggest subcategories are pale lagers and dark lagers, and then there are a couple specialized varieties aside from that. So to talk about pale lagers, first we have Pilsners. Pilsners are by far and away the most popular style of beer in the world, and generally what we think of when we think of lager beer, or just honestly beer in general. I talked about Pilsners in the Czech Republic episodes, but basically these were beers created by Germans and Czechs working together in the 1800s and then exploding in popularity over the course of the 20th century. Why do we not talk about Pilsners as just lagers in general, or just beer in general? Well, because there are a variety of non-Pilsner style lagers. The first of these is Helles. Helles, meaning light or bright in the Bavarian dialect of German, is a style of beer that pretty much, if it's not a Pilsner, is going to be the next most popular category of light lager. The Helles, also if it's not referred to as that, is generally just called pale lager. This style of beer, if you couldn't guess, predates the Pilsner. It was the style we talked about where the Germans would put barley and water in barrels and then they'd bury that sort of with the ice. Helles is about, you could say maybe 500 to 600 years old. Again, we're kind of rough on the dates here, but it's somewhere in that general category. And yes, this style of beer originated in Germany, or at least the German-speaking lands of Central Europe. American lager. The American lager is often defined by the likes of companies like Anheuser-Busch, though not exclusively. These beers tend to have very light bodies and are often brewed with a certain amount of corn or rice used in sort of the brewing process, in essentially the mash, which is different from most beer, which usually uses barley. Barley is kind of the most typical grain that you brew beer from. The American lager by the mid-20th century developed a reputation of being generally a very low quality, though that's not necessarily the case. And increasingly, there are some American craft breweries that are trying to kind of reclaim the idea of the American lager as something that doesn't have to be of bad quality. But either way, American lagers are generally going to be very light, very sort of easy to drink, and somewhere between the Helles and the Pilsner in terms of how bitter or hoppy they are. Some people would argue that the American lager is not really its own category, it's just kind of an offshoot of the Pilsner, but the World Beer Cup, which is an internationally renowned beer competition, does have a category for, quote, American-style premium lager. So I'm counting them as their own category. So you're probably thinking, sure, that's fine, we've got these three versions of beer, but how are they all different from each other? Or maybe you're not thinking that at all. Anyway, here's how you want to think about it. Helles is basically the original pale lager that's going to have a light to sort of medium body and is going to be rather, I don't want to say sweet, but a beer that has some very, very slight sweet notes to it. Not always, but usually. This beer is also going to be a bit on the smoother and sort of malty side, so there's very little in the way of hops, usually in the brewing process. Pilsners are, by contrast, essentially the original Helles lager, just made with more hops. They are in effect hoppier versions of Helles pale lagers. The hops is going to add a bit of that kind of herbaceous plant feel to the beer. So chances are, if you're drinking a pale lager and it's got a bit of that crisp bite to it, it's probably a Pilsner. Then thrown into the middle of everything are the American pale lagers. This beer is going to be, at least in theory, less hoppy than a true Czech Pilsner, but it's going to have a little bit more sort of crisp bitterness than your original Helles pale lager. Got it? All right, moving on. So in the dark category, we have two major types: Dunkels and Schwarzbiers, meaning dark and black, respectively, in German. Dunkel, or Dunkel, as Americans might say, is a style of dark beer that ranges from about amber to really dark brown and is very much characterized by having sort of a very smooth malty taste to it. These beers are also a little bit on the higher end in terms of ABV, around kind of 5.5% to 6%, though that's not always the case. Schwarzbier. One notable characteristic of the Schwarzbier is the use of roasted barley in the brewing process, which is the same thing actually that you get in stouts. Schwarzbiers also tend to have more notable either bitter or sort of sweet notes to them, though this of course can range on the beer in particular. Schwarzbiers also tend to have lighter bodies to them, at least relative to something like a stout or a porter. Something that kind of shares that very dark color. You think it might have a very heavy body. Schwarzbiers, generally that's less of the case. So to recap the differences, Dunkels are going to be amber to sort of very dark brown in color, have a very sort of smooth malty feel to them. Schwarzbiers are going to have more notable either sort of bitter or slightly sweet notes to them, though of course they're still going to be a little malty, and they're going to be really, really legitimately black in color and a little bit on the sort of lighter to medium body. Now to get into the specialized categories. First we have amber lagers. Amber lagers, if you couldn't guess from the name, are, well, lagers that are amber in color. The amber lagers are basically sort of like a mix between the light lagers and the dark lagers. They're kind of medium bodied, and their flavor profile is usually defined by kind of toasted caramel malt along with some hoppiness. The Vienna style amber lager, which is a little bit more on the malty side, is generally seen as the most popular variety of amber lager. The Märzen, or Marzen if you're American, means March beer, as in, the month. And this is a style of lager from Bavaria. Märzens originated in Bavaria in the 1500s, when it was actually illegal to brew beer between late April and late September. So these Märzen beers were amongst the last batches of beer brewed in the spring. They would then be stored in cellars, because you gotta have those cool temperatures for the bottom fermenting yeast, and then they would be cracked open just in time for Oktoberfest, which, as we all know, takes place in September. No, seriously, it actually does. I had to look that up. Well, okay, so it takes place from sort of late mid-September to kind of very, very early October, but still, not what you'd guess from the name, Bock's. The Bock is basically a high-strength alcohol lager with an ABV of 6% or more, and is usually, though not exclusively, a dark lager. Bocks typically have ABVs from 6% to 7.5% and range in color from copper to dark brown. Bocks are defined by having very sort of smooth, heavy, rich, malty flavors where there's almost no hops present. Essentially, I would define a Bock as basically just a higher alcohol strength version of a Dunkel. There are also a couple of varieties of Bocks. Maibock, or Maibock, as in the month of May. These are lighter and hoppier versions of the typical Bock. Doppelbock, or Double Bock. These are even higher strength alcohol versions of typical Bocks and range from 7 to 12% ABV. Weizenbock, or wheat bock. Please note, this is not a lager, but it is a wheat bock made with 40 to 60% wheat. Eisbock, or Eisbock. These are even higher strength alcohol bocks, where the beer is actually partially frozen and then the ice is taken out, and the ABV ranges from 8 to 14%. So anyway, those are lagers. I hope you enjoyed this. Hope you found it maybe slightly informative, perhaps learned something. And if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. If you have, awesome, thank you so much. And I'll see you next time.